Hi guys, and welcome back to a new video. If you're new here, my name is Lindsay. Welcome to my channel. I do true crime slash sometimes hamster content, sometimes art, sometimes whatever I want. But today's video is going to be part 2 of the Billy Hughes and Pottery Cottage Murders sequel. So if you haven't watched part 1, then go ahead and watch that first. It will make a lot more sense. The first part was mostly focused on Billy Hughes and his upbringing, and really helps to know exactly what type of person he was to understand what he went on to do in this video. He didn't do it in this video, but I will be talking about what he's done in this video. It will make a lot more sense. Just go ahead and watch it, and I'm afraid this video is going to be even longer from the looks of it, so grab a coffee, a beverage, anything. And just before I recap, I do want to point out that this video will be mentioning topics of sexual assault and extreme violence. So if you do not want to hear about this, I completely understand, and please click out of this. But if you're fine with these topics, I will just recap really quickly. So Billy Hughes grew up in Preston and Blackpool, and he spent most of his life in and out of jail. Billy did get married to Jean Hughes, and they had a daughter together, Nicola. Though he was quite violent towards his wife, quite physically abusive, and he would also take out some anger on her own daughter, Tracy, as well as sometimes his own daughter, Nicola. He ended up going to jail for good when he assaulted a man with a brick and sexually assaulted his girlfriend in a park. And while he was in jail serving that sentence, somehow none of the information and the paperwork mentioning that he was an extremely dangerous inmate made it to the prison. So they just thought he was in just for sexual assault. They didn't realize just how dangerous Billy was. So they never took the precautions, and he ended up getting a job in a kitchen, stole a knife, and on his way to court one day, he managed to stab the officers and the driver and escape. His escape coincided with one of the worst winters the UK had seen in decades. I ended the last video when he crashed the taxi into a wall and ran away. So police quickly found the taxi, but when they got there, he was gone. Billy had crashed the taxi at Beeley Moor, and because of the weather, police assumed he had run off to the nearest main roads just to get away from it. They didn't assume he would be running through the moorlands because it was snowing, there was a snowstorm going on, it was way too cold and way too windy. They did bring sniffer dogs to try and help locate the direction in which Billy had gone. However, the sniffer dogs were deemed useless because they basically jumped over the wall, sniffed for a bit, peed, and then ran back to their handlers. Though the handlers did say that there was quite an extensive amount of blood inside the taxi that wasn't Billy's blood. So the dogs could have gotten confused because there was the blood of 3 other people in that taxi, and he could have gotten confused with the smells. So they really had no idea which direction Billy had gone in. Peter Hughes was put in charge of the search for Billy Hughes, and he tried to find a map of the area, and with fellow officers and investigators, they tried to figure out where he could possibly be running to, because it didn't seem like he had a vehicle anymore. So the most logical assumption would be he ran off to the nearest main road and flagged down a vehicle or hijacked another car. Though because of the weather, they knew it was absolutely freezing cold, it was really windy, and it was snowing. So they knew he might look for a shed or an abandoned farm, or even go into someone's home just to find shelter. So they immediately decided to start searching any property, any building, any house, any farm in the area just to see if they could find Billy hiding there. Of course, Peter and the team tried to warn the local community that a very dangerous inmate was on the loose. Unlike the prisons where Billy was sent to, Peter Hughes and his team did get the information and the background on Billy Hughes, so they knew exactly just how dangerous he was and that he would really stop at nothing. This man was terrified of going back to jail. He knew this time that if he was going back to jail, it was for good. He wasn't getting out, and he would stop at nothing to keep his freedom. So they tried to inform the local community, and it quickly made the national news. Police's first thought was that Billy would try and make his way back to Blackpool, where Jean and his daughter lived, because he had a connection there. Even though they weren't really speaking anymore, he had left Blackpool. they thought that that connection might make him want to go back there. He always went back to Jean whenever he was in trouble. They thought this would be no different, and she was very likely to cover for him. So they were keeping their minds focused on the fact that he might be headed in that direction. But of course, they were very concerned for Jean's safety as well as her daughters. So they decided to move Jean and the daughters to a safe location. Of course, overnight, the snow kept falling and the weather just got worse and worse. So it looked like no matter where Billy was, he would be snowed in, just like the rest of northern England. Surprisingly, Billy had survived the crash and came out of it quite unscathed, so he didn't suffer any major injuries, and the first thing he did was just run. He did look at the main road and he was quite tempted, but he knew police were going to be chasing him and they would find his car very soon. So although he was surrounded by open moorland, so it was just open space with very little space to hide, very little opportunity to hide, but he still ran for it. He bolted and tried to get himself as far away from the crash as possible, and as soon as he could kind of hide himself, he just stayed there for a little while deciding where to go next. By that point, it was absolutely freezing outside, but as I've said in the previous video, Billy never seemed to be affected by pain. He had a very high tolerance for pain, so he powered through the horrendous weather and just kept walking for hours. He made his way through the hills and down a valley until he found the entrance to Dalebrook House, and he was about to make his way towards that house when he saw a van pull into the driveway. So he no longer had the advantage of sneaking up on whoever was living there. So he kept walking through the hills, he kept walking for a little while until he found the entrance to Pottery Cottage, and he had a look around and spotted an open shed where he decided to take refuge. Pottery Cottage belonged to Arthur and Amy Minton, as well as Richard and Gillian Moran. Arthur and Amy Minton were actually Gillian's parents. And she was born on March 24th, 1938. It is said that Gillian was quite close to her father growing up, and she was really into animals, and he really indulged her whenever he could. She wanted to become a dog breeder, though when it was time to go to college, she ended up going to Secretarial College. She was incredibly bright, incredibly smart, and really good at her job. She quickly found work as a typist and then as a delivery driver, and it was while she was working as a delivery driver that she met her husband, Richard Moran. Richard Moran was actually a very shy Irish man who was too shy to ask her out, so he ended up asking her out through a friend. On their first date, Richard allegedly told Gillian that she was too pretty to be put on a shelf and that if she wasn't married within a year, he would marry her himself. And he actually ended up marrying her a couple months later, so he didn't even wait a year. But they were very much in love and very happy together. Richard ended up getting a promotion as departmental manager, and he ended up having to move to Derbyshire. I am not saying that right. Derbyshire? Derbyshire. I'm just gonna write that down. The Derby area. They ended up having to move there so he would be closer to his work because he would often travel to Birmingham. And Gillian was very close to her parents, and she was quite concerned that they were getting older and that her father, who had an artificial limb, was going to have trouble moving around and being mobile. So they actually made the decision to move in with Gillian and Richard. So Amy and Arthur sold their business, retired, and moved to Derbyshire with Richard and Gillian. Of course, the next step for Gillian and Richard was to start their own family. They could not wait to be parents, but unfortunately, after 7 years of trying, they could not get pregnant. So they were left with two options, IVF or adoption. And they ended up choosing adoption, and they filed an official application for adoption on the 20th of September 1966. They knew that this would likely take some time and that they wouldn't get a match right away, but they were willing to wait. They had already waited 7 years, and they just wanted to have their own family. It didn't matter if it wasn't their own biological child. They got extremely lucky, and only 3 months later, they welcomed Sarah into the family. And what's crazy is she was actually born on the day they made that application. So she was born on September 20th, 1966, the day Richard and Jill filed the form for the application process. Of course, now that they had a new member in the family, the house was getting a bit too crowded, so they ended up moving to a larger place. Jillian and Richard decided that they wanted Sarah to grow up in the countryside where she could play with animals and share her mother's love for animals. After looking for a while, they found the perfect place in Eastmoor, and it was called North End Farm. It would require a little bit of work, but they were open to that, and also because the parents were moving in with Jillian and Richard and Sarah, they still wanted their own privacy. So they bought this beautiful estate and decided to split the house in two. So there would be one door that joined both sides of the house, but Jill and Richard and Sarah would have their own spot, and Amy and Arthur could still get their own privacy, and they could hang out whenever they wanted through that door. The estate was built in a way that they actually had neighbors within that same building. At the end of it, I'm not quite sure how the architecture worked, but at the end of it was a separate house that belonged to Len and Joyce Newman, who were head teachers. They all moved to North End Farm on October 1969 and decided to rename it Pottery Cottage. And just as Jillian wished, she wanted her daughter to have the same passion for animals as she did, and they ended up getting 2 dogs, a basset hound, and a Labrador. And they also got a cat and a rabbit. Once Sarah was old enough to go to school, she turned 5, and Jillian ended up having some free time, and they also wanted to help out with the bills. So she got a job as a secretary again, and she was really, really good at her job. Jillian's mother, Amy, although she was retired, she would also make a little bit of extra money by cleaning the Newman house. So Len and Joyce Newman, who lived nearby next door, she would clean their house twice a week and also take out the dogs whenever they needed while they were at work, and she would make a little bit of extra cash that way. In 1973, Richard was offered a job as sales director at Brett Plastics. It was a brand new company. He was a bit nervous moving to a smaller company, but in no time, he made more money than he had ever made. And I also want to point out that Sarah was very bright. She was very smart, and her teacher actually considered having her skip a year, which was very uncommon at the time, but that's how smart Sarah was. The Mintons and the Morans were living the perfect life. They had a happy family, everything was doing well, their careers were going well, they had enough money, Sarah was thriving, she was doing so well in school, they had their own animals, and everything was a fairy tale until their paths crossed with Billy Hughes. As I've stated, Billy spotted Pottery Cottage and spotted the shed in the yard, and he ended up going into that shed where he started looking for tools because he knew he was hunted by the police. So if he wanted to survive or fight his way out of it, he would need to look for tools immediately, or weapons. And he looked around and found 2 axes. He had actually lost the boning knife that he had stolen from the kitchen and the prison, and that he had used to stab the officers. He had somehow lost it after the crash and while he was running away from the crash site, so he didn't have a weapon on him. So he found these 2 axes and headed for the kitchen where Amy Minton was preparing dinner. Of course, she was expecting Jillian to walk through the door. What she found was a terrifying man who was soaked to the bone with dark hair plastered against his face. Billy told her, "I'm wanted by the police, but I'm not going to hurt you." And she didn't even scream. She just froze. She didn't even know what to do. She just stood there, and he said, "Tell me who lives here." Of course, Amy's husband, Arthur, heard voices coming from the kitchen. He also thought that Jillian was home, so he made his way to the kitchen, where Billy struck him on the head so hard that he fell. And Billy told Arthur, "The police want me. I'm going to stay here until it's dark. Do as I say, and I won't hurt you." And he did keep repeating that. He kept telling them, "If you do as I say, everything will be all right." None of them had listened to the news that day, so they had no idea that he was a dangerous inmate on the run. They only knew that he had told them that he was on the run from the police, but he had no idea who he was or just how dangerous he was. He kept asking Amy who was living in this house. He needed to know who was going to come home, who else was on the premises, so that he could control the situation. Amy told him that she knew when Sarah would be home from school, and she also knew roughly when Jillian would be home from work. However, she had no idea when Richard would be back because he was traveling all the way from Birmingham and the weather was awful. So there was really no way to know exactly when he would pull up in the driveway. The second thing Billy did was to ask for a tour of the house so that he could know exactly where he was and be aware of his surroundings. And on that tour, he brought both axes with him just to remind Amy and Arthur that he was in charge. As they were walking through the house, he noticed the telephone and he disconnected it, which must have been the most terrifying thing. You're giving a tour of your house to a guy with 2 axes who tells you he's on the run from the police, and the first thing he does is disconnect the phone. And I can't think of anything worse, honestly. He goes to the first floor, checks out the bedrooms. He sees Richard and Jill's room as well as Sarah's room, and then they show him their side of the house, so the Mintons' side of the house. And he's kind of taking in the fact that this house has 2 sections to it. They eventually made their way back to the kitchen, where he put the axes down on the table within reach and started going through drawers where he could finally find a boning knife, which is the exact same type of knife he had stolen from the prison kitchen and that he had lost. So he got himself another knife and he secured it in his waistband so everyone could see he had a knife on him. He was talking to Amy and trying to get more information about each family member while waiting for everybody to come home. And they were just talking when Jillian finally pulled up. And when she got home, she was actually quite surprised to find the gate open because the dogs could just run away. So her parents always made sure that the gate was shut. She thought it was very odd that the gate would be open, but she just walked through the gate, came up to the kitchen door and was trying to get inside, but it was actually locked, which again was very unusual. They always left the doors open. They barely had any neighbors. It was in the middle of nowhere. So she ended up knocking and her mother came to the door. But before letting her in, she told her, "Don't panic. There's a man with a knife. He's running from the police. If you keep calm, he won't hurt us." Which again is also the last thing you want to hear when you come home from work and you go inside the house and your mom opens the door and she says, "I gotta be honest with you, there is a man with a knife who is running away from the police." It must have been absolutely terrifying. When Jill came home from work, they were actually having tea and coffee and talking casually. So she joined them and sat with them and they kept talking. Well, mostly Billy kept talking and he told them everything he had done leading up to his escape. So he spared no details. He talked about how he got into jail multiple times and what he had done to the officers, and he told them that he had stabbed the officers just enough that they would be injured, but not enough that they would actually die from the injuries. But he made it clear to them that he knew exactly how to kill. Unfortunately, Billy was quite smart as well, or at least when it came to trying to run away, he knew what to expect. So he knew that because of the weather, police would still be searching for him. They wouldn't stop just because it was snowing, but if anything, police guessed that the weather would have stopped Billy from going very far. So he already predicted that police was going to be going door to door and checking every farm, every house, and he needed a plan. If police came to the door, he told Jill that if police came to the door asking who was in the house, he would go into the bathroom with her and run a bath. And that way Amy and Arthur could tell police it's just Jillian upstairs, but she's having a bath, so no need to check. There's definitely no one else in there with her. And he was already trying to come up with plans in case police would come looking for him in Pottery Cottage. She did not want to be involved in this plan at all, but obviously what are you going to do? This guy is carrying 2 axes and a knife, so the whole time she's just hoping, let's just hope we don't get to that stage. Like, maybe he can leave soon. But she was getting very nervous because he was still there and she knew Sarah was coming home from school any minute. And she really didn't want her daughter to be in this situation, but also she knew that her daughter was quite smart and that she might pick up on the fact that Billy's a weirdo and he's a lunatic and he's on the run, and she didn't want her daughter exposed to that, or her daughter asking any questions like a 10-year-old child would. So she told Billy that she would be telling Sarah that Billy was just a stranded driver whose car had broken down and that he was just using the phone and waiting for someone to help him out. So that was quite common back then. You could go up to someone's house and use their landline if you were stranded. Nowadays, like, I'm not answering the door. That's just not happening. But back then, if you were stranded, especially in the middle of the nowhere in the countryside, they had done it before. Sarah had seen it and she knew that whenever someone was stranded because of their car, that her mom and her dad would offer whoever it was, they would offer tea and coffee and just kind of host them until they could drive off again. So it was a very believable story. Billy approved, and Sarah came home from school. When Sarah came inside the home, Jill brought her into the living room, said, "Look, we have a visitor," and tried to sound excited about it, hoping that Sarah wouldn't be like, "This guy has a knife." So luckily, Sarah just bought it. She was quite happy with the explanation. She didn't really look much into it, and she was just minding her own business. She was sewing for a little bit. They were all chatting, and because the atmosphere seemed relaxed, she didn't panic. She didn't have any reason to suspect anything. She ended up going to Arthur and Amy's side of the house to watch TV with Arthur. So she and her grandfather went to the other side. Billy said it was okay. Without telling Sarah, he nodded to Arthur that they could go to the other side of the house to watch TV, and that way he wouldn't have to deal with Sarah. So now it was just Amy, Jillian, and Billy waiting for Richard. Of course, time went on, Richard still wasn't home, and Billy did want to leave. He did want to keep his escape going. He wasn't planning on staying there very long, but he was also waiting for Richard to be back because he felt like he couldn't just leave like that. He felt like they might call the police. For whatever reason, he waited for Richard to come home, but in the meantime, he was getting very restless, and he decided to plug the phone back in again. So he disconnected the phone when he was doing a tour of the house, and then all of a sudden he's like, wait, this doesn't make sense. Why did I disconnect the phone? So he plugged the phone back in, and the second he did, the phone rang. They all kind of stared at each other, and he told Jillian to answer the phone, but to act normal and do as I say. On the phone was Anne Goldthorpe, who was one of Jill's friends, and she was calling just to ask her if she had heard about the man on the loose, the man who had run away from jail, the very, very dangerous man who had escaped jail, crashed a taxi, and injured police officers, because this was part of the local community awareness. So police was trying to warn as many people as possible, and back then, the quickest way to do it would be kind of like a phone tree. Is that what it's called? Like you just like someone calls someone who calls someone, and I mean, you know how gossip works. Like everyone knows in no time. So this was part of the calls. Like they were all checking that everyone knew that this man was on the loose, but the whole time Billy's sitting right there and he can hear exactly what she's saying. So it must have been it must have been so stressful to be on that phone call, and you're like, never heard of this man. Like, that's crazy. That's fucking wild. Like, I can't believe this man's on the loose. But don't worry, we're all home, we're all safe. So she reassured Anne, who didn't suspect anything. Anne was just being a good friend, trying to warn Jill, and Jill was saying, thank you, we'll keep an eye out, and hung up. By 6:15, Richard got home. He was actually really looking forward to relaxing. After a very long day of traveling through horrendous weather, he had meetings all day in Birmingham, and he finally got home, and he just couldn't wait to sit down and relax. But as he pulled up, Billy noticed that Richard was coming home, and he really didn't know how Richard was going to react. So he held Jillian at knife point. He grabbed Jillian, held her at knife point, and told Amy to answer the door and to tell Richard that if he didn't act calm, Jillian would get stabbed. And they tried to tell him that Richard was not going to react in a crazy way. He was a very calm man. He wasn't the type to react, and he was very nonviolent. So, of course, Billy has no way of knowing that, and he wasn't going to take any chances. And when Richard walked through the door, Billy said, "Don't come near or I'll kill her." As predicted, Richard did not react in any way. He just held his hands up and he slid his car keys over to Billy and said, "Look, the tank is full, the car's in the driveway, like just take the car, leave my wife alone, you can just go, we won't tell anybody, just like please leave us alone." So he was very chill considering the situation, but obviously he didn't want to risk anything. This man was holding his wife at knife point. Instead of taking the keys and making a run for it, he decided to tie everybody up. He wasn't ready to have people walking around, especially because there were 5 of them, though in this room it was just Richard, Amy, Jillian, and Billy. But he ended up tying Richard and Amy up, as well as Jillian, and they tried to protest. They tried to tell him, like, look, you really don't need to tie us up. We're not going to do anything. We'll help you escape if you want us to. Arthur heard the commotion and came from the other side of the house. And when he saw that Billy was tying up his family, he tried to put up a fight. Arthur lunged towards Billy and tried to stop him from restraining everybody. And he told him, what the hell are you doing? You need to stop this. But of course, Billy was having none of that. And unfortunately, Billy was extremely strong. So he ended up restraining Arthur as well. And at first, Sarah was very upset because obviously she's 10 years old and she's watching all of this unfold, and she can see that the adults are actually clearly upset and being tied up. And initially she started reacting, but when she realized that she was going to be next, she got very quiet. And luckily, Billy decided that there would be no need to restrain Sarah. He ended up gagging everybody and moving every single family member to different rooms inside the house, so they wouldn't really know who was where and how anyone else was doing. So he isolated every single one of them and then went back downstairs, and the whole house got very quiet. But after a minute, Sarah shouted, "Don't be fooled, Mom. He's being quiet. He's not gone yet." And that was just Sarah trying to warn her mom that although it was quiet, that she shouldn't come out of the room because he was still in the house. He hadn't left. And that would be the last time that Jillian heard Sarah. The next thing Jillian could hear was moaning and thuds from the ground floor, and she quickly realized that it was Billy beating up Arthur. And it was so bad that she could hear it from her room, and she was terrified. She knew her dad was extremely resilient and strong, but he's also quite old and frail, and this was turning into an actual nightmare. A few minutes later, Billy brought water to every single one of the family members to let them drink. They were temporarily ungagged and he helped them drink water. And when he got to Jillian's room, he let her drink before untying her and sexually assaulting her. Oddly enough, after the assault, he kind of shifted his entire attitude towards her. He seemed a bit more kind and caring. He was even concerned at some point that she would be cold, so he pulled the covers over her. And when he did tie her up again, he tied her hands in the front instead of in the back. And she felt like she was in a situation where she could ask him a few questions, and all she wanted to know was to know how Sarah was doing. Billy told Jillian that Sarah was doing well and that he had a daughter himself, Nicola, and that because he had a daughter himself, he could never harm Sarah. After that, he made his way to the room where Richard was, and he just started talking to him, just like they were old pals catching up, and he would tell him stories about his time in prison, and he would make up some of the stories as well. And Richard must have been standing there. Of course, he didn't realize that his wife had just been sexually assaulted, but even if that hadn't happened, imagine just being tied up and gagged, and the guy who did that to you just walks into your room and just starts telling old stories about his time in prison. This entire case and this entire story at Pottery Cottage is one of the worst cases I've ever heard of. And that is definitely the stuff of nightmares. On Thursday, January 13th, 1977, the next day, the police search continued, and they were even offered 2 helicopters by the army, but unfortunately the weather kept getting worse and they couldn't fly that day. Though I don't think it would have made much difference because he was already inside Pottery Cottage, so I don't think they would have seen anything. But it had kept snowing that night and the snow was getting thicker and thicker. They were really hoping that because it was likely Billy held a family hostage or broke into a house to find refuge in this weather, that they would notice something unusual at school. Like maybe because it was a small area and a small village and a small type of town feeling, they thought that maybe school would notice if a child didn't come in that day, or maybe if someone skipped work that day, that they could check that family out and see if they were safe or if they were being held hostage. However, because of the weather, it turned into a gigantic snow day. So a lot of schools were closed. A lot of people never made it to work. They couldn't even physically make it to work because of the weather. So that entire lead was gone. They couldn't rely on that. Meanwhile, at Pottery Cottage, Jillian hadn't slept all night. She had been wide awake the whole time and terrified of what was going to happen next. Billy woke her up, walked into her room, and said, "I'm going to need you to run some errands. You need to go to the shop and get me the newspapers. I need to know every single roadblock, and I need to know what the news are saying so that he can be in control of the information and run away better." He didn't want her to raise any suspicions, so he told her to get dressed and ready and put makeup on just as she would any other day, and to look as normal as possible. And of course, the whole time he just stayed there watching her get dressed and get ready. So while he was watching her, she decided to ask about Sarah again because she wanted to know where her daughter was. And he told her that Sarah was with Arthur in the annex, so in the Minton side of the house, and that they were together and that she was fine. She was a little bit relieved at that, but just as she was about to go downstairs to leave, Billy had looked outside the window and started shouting at Jillian. Billy had seen a truck roll up the driveway, and he was furious. Like, he didn't know what this truck was, what it was doing there. He was worried that someone had called the cops or that the police was there. He didn't know who this person was, who this truck was, so he started shouting at Jillian, saying, "What the hell is this? Who is in your driveway?" And that's when she realized with horror that it was a council truck coming to empty the septic tank that they had planned ages ago. So that was the date he was meant to come. And side note that has nothing to do with his case, but like the fact that in 77, a council truck still showed up on a snow day in the worst winter in decades, still did their job, still showed up on time. Like nowadays, you would like 2 years later, you'd still be waiting. Like, it's absolutely amazing. Like, that was the most unbelievable part of the case, was what, like, reading. If you live in the UK, you'll know. Like, maybe you live in a nice part, but like some councils, like the guy showed up on the worst winter day of like the 70s, 80s, 60s, and still showed up to empty the septic tank. And some people couldn't even get to work. Like, I find that wild. I'm sorry, this is just a side note, but I had to point that out. Of course, Jill couldn't send the man away. She had booked this. So Billy told her to just go outside and act normal. And she did. She went outside. She asked the driver if he needed her to sign any paperwork, which he did once he was finished. So she signed it and she didn't say anything. She knew Billy was watching from a window. So as much as she was tempted to write help on the paperwork, she was afraid that the guy would be like, "What do you mean help?" Or I don't know, just blow it. So she was afraid Billy was going to see it. She did not want to risk it. She felt like if she followed Billy's orders, that he would be gone in no time. Jillian made her way back inside the house, and as she was coming back inside the house, she walked past the lounge where she saw Arthur, her father, sitting in a chair. And she was very surprised because he was kind of lying there unresponsive. He was just sitting there and he had a blue coat on top of him, but his artificial leg was sitting at a very weird angle. It didn't look comfortable at all. So she was about to go in and check on her dad when Billy noticed that she was looking into the lounge, and he just grabbed her and forbid her from ever going back in there again. Once he closed the lounge door, he made her call in sick. Then he made her call Sarah's school to let them know that Sarah was sick and that she wouldn't be in that day. And then he made Richard call in sick at work. And Richard didn't sound as convincing as Jill did. So his work actually called him back to be like, "Are you sure you're okay? Like, are you fine?" And the guy's like, "I just called in sick. Like, please just leave me alone. Like, I just called in sick." So they kind of believed that he was acting odd or sounding off just because he had a flu. So they didn't really question it much more than that, and he hung up. He finally made Jillian go and get newspapers and cigarettes, and he reminded her that her entire family was with him, but he wasn't too concerned. He knew that she had an opportunity to get help when the council guy came for the septic tank, and she didn't, so he was a little bit more confident that she wouldn't run away or alert anyone. So he sent her off. She purchased the newspapers and the cigarettes, didn't raise any suspicion, although the whole time she was absolutely terrified. She made it back home, and this time when she walked past the lounge, she noticed that her dad was no longer sitting in that chair. So she asked Billy where her dad was, and he said he's in his room. And of course that was on the other side of the house, in his own side of the house where Sarah was as well. And she knew he wouldn't let her go and see her dad or Sarah. So instead, she made drinks, she made tea and coffee, and she brought tea and coffee to her mom and Richard, who were in that side of the house, while Billy took beverages to Arthur and Sarah. Once Billy was done bringing the drinks to Sarah and Arthur, he went back upstairs where he grabbed Jill, brought her back to her room, and sexually assaulted her again. Finally, that day, Billy decided to start planning his escape. And in order to escape, he would need some money. Of course, he had nothing on him. He had stolen some money from the taxi driver and the police officers that he had attacked at the crash site. But it wasn't enough for him to run away. So he needed to find money, and he knew that there was a friend of his who still owed him money for a job they did together. Initially, he was going to go with Richard to that friend's house to get the money, but he decided to take Jill with him instead, and she was losing it. She hadn't slept all night. She was incredibly stressed, incredibly tired, just emotionally 1,000,000% distressed, and now he wanted to take her with him on this journey to get cash from a friend, and she tried to plead with him. He said, look, I'm definitely leaving tonight, but I need money, you're coming with me. But she ended up breaking down, and Billy decided to just bring out the whiskey, and they started having drinks, and it actually kind of helped with the atmosphere. There was a lot of tension, but he ended up bringing Richard and Jillian to Sarah's room, which is where Amy was. And they played cards, they had some drinks, it kind of relieved some of the tension. But of course, Jill and Amy were still, Richard as well, but Amy was very concerned because she hadn't heard or seen her husband in ages. And of course, Jillian was very concerned for Sarah because although she was with Arthur, they just had no way of talking, and she wanted to see her daughter. Amy wanted to see her husband. Of course, they didn't have any doubts that they were in any danger. They just wanted to hear from them. They knew that Arthur and Sarah were safe, but as her mom, Jill knew that Sarah would have certain demands because she was a 10-year-old girl, and she actually never slept without a comfort blanket or her little soft toy elephant. She had a gray elephant and a little blanket that she always slept with, and she told Billy about this. She said, it's a bit weird Sarah didn't ask for this because she never sleeps without it. And he's like, well, she was fine. She's sleeping with Arthur, so she's absolutely fine. And she's like, could you please just take this to Sarah? Please, just do this for me. She will sleep much better with it. So he's like, fine. Grabbed the comfort blanket and the elephant and brought it to Sarah to the other side of the house. And when he came back, he said she was very happy to see them. By 7:30 that night, Billy decided to do a test run of an escape, and also he wanted to drop by his friend's house to get some cash. He ended up taking both Richard and Jill, not just Jill, so he took both of them in the car with him, and as they were making their way towards his friend's house, he realized that it was becoming impossible to drive in this weather. The weather kept getting worse, and it was snowing and snowing. And they heard a radio announcement saying that police were halting the search temporarily because of the weather. So they pointed out the fact that police had stopped the search. This is perfect. You should leave now. Now is the time to go. Please leave. Police have stopped the search. He's like, this is a decoy. They're lying. This is a trap. They want me to hear this message and then run away. I don't think that was a trap. I think police genuinely stopped the search because there was no way anyone could get anywhere, so that wherever Billy was, he wouldn't be able to get anywhere either. So they stopped the search because pretty much no one could get anywhere. So they decided to make their way back to Pottery Cottage, but by the time they got back, Billy changed his mind again. So he grabbed one of Richard's suitcases and started filling it up. He decided he wanted to escape again, go see his friend again, get the cash. So he started putting stuff that didn't belong to him, obviously, just stuff around the house, into the suitcase. And he asked Jill if she had a wig, which she did, but it was a nice wig, and she really didn't want to give it to him. But at the same time, she was thinking, if it makes this man leave, I will give him 10 wigs. So she installed the wig on him. It actually looked quite good, as in he wasn't as recognizable and it was believable. So she put the wig on him, and then he said, get ready, I'm going to tie up Richard and Amy, put them in Sarah's room. He didn't gag them this time. He left them water in case they were thirsty. and then took Jill with him to drive to his friend's place. Billy decided to drive this time, and they were getting quite close to his friend's place when he stopped the car because he realized that he had left some letters back at Pottery Cottage, and that those letters had an address on it, on one of the letters, and that was one of the addresses he wanted to go to. So he couldn't leave the letters behind because then they would have a clue as to where he was headed. So he decided to turn around, and Jill absolutely lost it. She couldn't take it anymore. She was done. She just couldn't do this back and forth. She just wanted him gone. She wanted to go back to her family. She wanted to be safe. She wanted to see her daughter again. She wanted to see her dad again. She wanted to go back to her regular life, and this man was making their entire existence a living hell. So they got back to Pottery Cottage. He left Jill in the car, ran inside, and came back outside, and she assumed that he had gotten the letters because he was quite happy to get back on the road again. And she said, "Wouldn't it be great if you just let me drive home on my own and you found another car, and I can just drop you off in a car park and you can just steal a car, and that way I won't even know what car you're in, so that way if you're afraid that we're going to tell police about where you're going, no need, we don't even know what car you're in." So she was trying to give this idea, and he did consider it for a second, but he's like, I don't want a car park. Like, I'm not going to steal a car. What I'll do is I'll just flag a car down, hijack it, and keep whoever's driving it hostage until I get to my next destination, which of course Jill was very uncomfortable with because she didn't want to put anyone else in her situation. As much as she didn't want to be in that situation anymore, she didn't want someone else to have to live through this. So that wasn't really becoming an option anymore. It was 1 a.m. by the time they got to his friend's house, and Jill pulled over and she let him run off. He was gone for a few minutes when he came running back into the car and just peeled out of there. He rushed off in the car, and he said that he had actually hit an officer on the head and that he had fallen as a result, and that he would come back to consciousness in no time, but he was afraid that they would set off the alarm, so he kind of peeled out of there. And what's crazy is the whole time Jillian had no idea, but he had made the entire story up. There was no policeman. There wasn't even a friend. The friend he said he was getting money from didn't live there. He had no friend there. There was no money. He didn't steal anything. I don't know what he did. He just kind of broke into someone's house, I think, and then just made his way back to the car. I don't know what he was looking for, and I don't know what he was hoping to find, but he didn't, and they got back into the car and rushed off. They finally made it back to Pottery Cottage. It was extremely late into the night, and they decided to have some coffee, and all four of them slept in Sarah's room. I think Jill was terrified of being alone again because she knew that he would sexually assault her. So she came up with the idea that all four of them should stay in the same room. That way he could keep an eye on all three of them. And I think that was her way to keep herself safe. The next day, on Friday 14th, Billy woke up. He made Jill prepare breakfast for everyone, and he told Jill and Richard that they would have to go into town to buy him some groceries because he was definitely leaving for real this time. For real. He was running away, but he needed some supplies, and they didn't really argue with him. Obviously, why would they? He's carrying a knife, but also they were really looking forward to this whole situation being over. So he told them he needed tins, a gas stove, like the camping stoves that you can have with you and bring on the go, stew, tins of soup, items with long shelf life. He needed alcohol, he needed cigarettes, and every single newspaper that they could find. Not just the local ones, he wanted the national ones. He wanted to know everything police was saying. He wanted to know everything so that he could remain on the loose. Although what I find extremely cheeky is that he actually gave them cash from his pocket to pay from the groceries when they know he stole that money from them. And like the audacity of this man to be like, here's 25 pounds. Also buy a nice gift for Sarah because she's been such a good girl. And they're like, thank you. When it's their own money. Like, this man is just the worst. At first, when they started driving, they didn't speak. They knew it was just the two of them. This would be the first time they would get the chance to talk unsupervised. But honestly, Billy was so terrifying that they felt that he was right behind them the whole time, or that he could hear what they were saying. So when they did finally start talking, they were just whispering. And the first thing Richard tried to do was to convince Jill to go to the police. And she said, absolutely goddamn not. I will literally never speak to you again if we do this. He told us if we just follow what he says, then he'll leave us alone. And that's what we're going to do. And he's going to leave us alone. He's leaving. We're buying him stuff. He's on his way. Period. Like, the end of the story. And that was that. And Richard wasn't exactly confrontational, but neither was Jill. And this was the one time she was putting her foot down. She's like, look, he's nearly gone. We are not ruining this. She was afraid it was going to be kind of like in the movies, and police would just roll up to the house with like the sirens blasting, and that it would give Billy time to realize what was going on and he would murder the whole family. So she's like, none of that. We're just going to do what he says, and he'll be gone in no time. They got all the shopping done. They got everything on the list. They even got a nice book for Sarah because she had been such a good girl. And they also stopped to get gas on the way back. And I think Richard was hoping that by keeping all of the cars with their tanks full, that Billy was more likely to escape. At least he could offer one of the cars and be like, look, it's filled, just take it and leave. So they filled it up on their way back. And when they got back, the groceries weren't enough anymore. Billy also wanted like a stupid amount of boiled eggs, which I guess is a good treat or snack to have on the go, like protein, and they keep for quite a while once they're cooked, I guess. So she started cooking like 13 eggs. And she was telling Billy, she's like, it's a bit weird that Sarah hasn't asked for a change of underwear, because she's a very clean girl. She doesn't like wearing dirty clothes, and nobody likes to wear underwear for more than like 24 hours, and it definitely had been longer than that. So she said, it's a bit odd. Can you please bring her a change? Because she's probably too sweet and too polite to ask, and probably too scared to ask. So her mom was thinking about her daughter, and she told Billy, please just bring her a fresh pair. So he did. He went across, he gave her the fresh pair, and when he came back, he said, she made me turn around. And Jill was very happy with that answer, because she knew that's exactly what her daughter would say. She would tell Billy to turn around while she changed. Of course, in the meantime, the search had started again, and police were quite convinced that he was headed towards the A6, because that would make the most sense, and he would be headed towards Blackpool as well. So he would be headed towards civilization, or open roads, or big roads, main roads, where he could flag down a car or make his way anywhere with a car. They also did search the area near the taxi crash, but of course it was just open moorland. Is it moorlands? I'm not sure, but it was just open fields, and there was no footprints. It had snowed so much there was nothing to see, and obviously nowhere to go, because they had searched the fields. There was nothing there, so it didn't go very far. As the hours passed, Jill and Richard were quite convinced that Billy was ready to leave any minute. So he had all the groceries, he had all the supplies, he had that suitcase he'd stolen from Richard with some of Richard's stuff, and he also had 13 boiled eggs. And so he was quite ready to leave. However, he still needed money. He hadn't successfully gotten the money from his friend the night before, so of course he still needed money, and he started asking Richard if he knew of a place that had money, or if his workplace had any cash. And Richard said, my place only has petty cash, so not a lot. He's like, perfect, let's go. So he made Jill and Richard drive him there, and once he got there, of course, because Richard had the keys, they didn't raise any suspicion. Richard went in first, but no one was around. It was quite late at night, and they ended up going to the accounts office, which is where there was a little bag of like coins and petty cash. Billy stole as much as he could, and he was quite happy with the money he had gotten. He had managed to get £210, which back then was definitely quite significant, but you know, nothing to start a new life with, but enough to run away. So he was quite happy with that. They got back into the car and drove back to Pottery Cottage. Once they got home with the money, he got all of his stuff ready and said, right, I'm ready to go. Jill, come with me. You're coming with me until I can hijack another car. And she just started protesting, saying, look, please don't take me with you. Just go. Just take the car. I do not need to be with you. we're not going to call anyone, but he was having none of it. I am so sorry if the angle is different. My phone was full of storage. The storage was full. You get it. You know what I'm talking about. So anyway. They got back home, he got all of his stuff ready, he was ready to go, and he told Jill that he would be taking her with him until he could find another car to hijack. And she obviously immediately started protesting, saying, look, please, you do not need me to come with you, just take any car, just leave us alone. We've done everything you wanted us to do, and it's still not enough. So of course she kept protesting, and he was having none of it. She told Richard and Amy that she was going to have to go with him when he tied them up and put them both in Sarah's room, and told them as he was tying them that this would be the last time he was tying them up. So he was definitely going for good. Jill reluctantly got into the car with him, and they started driving away when he finally stopped and said, I forgot the map at Pottery Cottage. We need to go back. And she was like, are you kidding me? She was absolutely irate. She couldn't handle it anymore. She was incredibly sleep deprived. She was incredibly stressed. She hadn't seen her daughter in days, and she just couldn't take it anymore. She just couldn't understand the audacity of this man to be like, for the millionth time, have to make the car turn around because he forgot something or changed his mind. She couldn't deal with it anymore. She tried to tell him that he could find a map at a gas station. He could get any other map anywhere, and that the signs, like the roads were clearly indicated, that he wouldn't be lost. There's signs everywhere. You don't need a map. You know where you're going. But he was having none of it, so he turned the car around and went back to Pottery Cottage. She waited in the car, but obviously he was taking quite some time, so she decided to turn off the engine to save on gas. But of course, when he came rushing out looking to rush off, they couldn't start the car again. Billy suggested that they take Jillian's car, which was in the garage, and there was no way they would manage to get this car out of the garage because of all the snow. So she told him it was hopeless and that they should just wait until the car cools down and the engine unfloods or whatever the issue was, and that they could start again. Billy, of course, immediately started really panicking, and Jill was like, look, let me just make a cup of tea. We'll wait inside until we can drive off again. And he said, no, you can't go back inside. We are not going back inside for tea. We are leaving now because the police is looking for me, especially because they had just stolen money from Richard's workplace. So they would probably pick up on the fact that they had stolen money from there. So what Billy decided to do was to make Jill ask her neighbors for a tow. So she really didn't want to get the Newmans involved, but he told her to go and knock on their door and ask if they could use their car to tow their own car until they could drive off. So she knocked on their door, and when Len Newman answered the door, she prayed and hoped that he would pick up on the fact that there was something wrong going on. He thought she was drunk at first, but he could see Billy in the background just observing the interaction. And she managed to let him know while whispering that this was the inmate who had escaped and who was all over the news. And he luckily quickly picked up on that. And once he realized who was with her, he realized they were in mortal danger. So he ran inside. He kind of shouted outside saying, I'll be right back. I'll grab my car. I'm just going to leave the dogs inside just so that they stay inside the house, and then grabbed his wife, told her this is life or death, got into their car and just bolted. So she didn't know what to do. Like she didn't know what to do. She had no help and she was alone. He started losing it, saying, you told them, didn't you? And she said, no, I absolutely did not. I swear. But she was hysterical and he was furious. And while this is all happening, Amy Minton was slowly making her way towards the car. And Jillian was looking at her and noticed that she was making very weird noises and that she wasn't walking normally. And Billy started panicking, seeing Amy walk towards her. And before Jill could realize that Amy had had her throat slashed, Billy grabbed her and took her to the back of the house where he could finish what he started. Jillian only knew that her mom was not doing well, and she didn't trust Billy when he said that she was fine, but she also didn't seem to quite understand the gravity of the situation. She had no idea that Billy had just hurt her mom. Before Amy could really understand what was going on, Billy just grabbed her and they made her run for it. He dragged her through the snow, through the fields, hiding whenever a car would drive by, and they finally made it to a nearby pub before continuing through the streets until they reached the Frost household that Gillian knew quite well. She knew the Frosts, so when she knocked on the door, they let her in and she managed to mouth help. And they quickly realized that she was in a very dangerous situation. While Ron Frost ran to get his car ready to help tow Gillian's car, Mrs. Frost ran over to a neighbor's house to try and get some help, though she didn't want to call police right away because she was afraid that her husband could get hurt in the meantime. So she kind of took her time calling police. However, Ron Frost immediately noticed that the man who was with Jill was very likely the escaped inmate on the loose, the very dangerous man, Billy Hughes. Ron Frost gave a lift to Jill and Billy all the way back to Pottery Cottage, towed the car, and as soon as the car was free, he literally just left. He left Jill with Billy. He just took off and ran back home to get more help. Jill was alone with Billy once again, and they had started driving off into, I was going to say into the sunset, but it's nighttime. So they just started his escape again. He started driving quite fast because he knew police was going to be there anytime. And he was right. Police was already on its way to Pottery Cottage. They had been informed of the fact that Jill Moran was in trouble and that she lived at Pottery Cottage. So police got there, and when they got there, every light was on in the house and music was blaring. The doors were locked, but they could hear dogs inside the house barking. They ended up breaking into the house through a window and opening the door from that window. So they just reached through the window and just kind of like open the door, if that makes sense. And they didn't see anything on the ground floor, but when they made their way upstairs, they started seeing blood, and they followed the trail of blood only to see one of the worst crime scenes they had ever witnessed. The first person they found was Richard, who was lying face down with a very serious stab wound in the neck. And it was a stab wound that was definitely intense enough to make him bleed out, but not crazy enough for him to die on the spot. So Billy had done exactly what he had done to the officers in the taxi, but unfortunately police didn't get there on time and Richard Moran was already dead. They started searching through the rest of the house and figured out that the house was split in two. Amy was in the garden, and they made their way to the Minton side of the house where they found Arthur and Sarah. It's actually believed that Arthur and Sarah had been dead for a while, and it's very, very likely that Billy killed them first. So the first night he was there, after Sarah had shouted, "Mom, don't be fooled, he's still there, he's just being quiet," it's very likely that that's when he made the decision to kill Sarah and Arthur just after he had beat Arthur up, just because they were probably the two most likely family members to create a problem. I'm not sure what his intentions were, but it is believed that they were the first to be murdered. So the entire time, Jill thought that Sarah was getting her comfort blanket and her teddy bear, and also that she was changing her underwear. He had made the whole thing up. All three family members had been stabbed multiple times, including a very serious stab wound in the neck area. In the meantime, police were racing to catch up with Jill and Billy. And luckily, Jill still had no idea what had happened to her family back at Pottery Cottage. She actually thought that she was sacrificing herself to save her family. She thought that because she was the one to be held hostage in this escape scenario with Billy, that she would risk dying so that her family could be safe at Pottery Cottage. She did understand that Billy had injured her mom, but she didn't understand the extent of the injury. She didn't understand that everyone was dead. Everyone in her family was dead back at the cottage. But the fact that she knew that Billy had injured her mom was the first sign of this hostage relationship breaking down. Police caught up to Billy quite quickly, and he realized that he was being chased by police, and he gave it all he got. He really actually did do quite a good job at escaping the police and trying to continue this car pursuit and his car chase as long as possible, although he did try to swerve around a roundabout, but he was going way too fast and ended up crashing into a wall. Miraculously, they weren't severely injured at all, but he quickly realized he couldn't crack the window or open the door. He was quite locked inside the car and he was surrounded by police. So the first thing he did was to grab Jill and hold her at knife point. The first thing Billy did was to demand a car that was fully fueled, and because he was holding a knife to Jill's throat, they didn't really argue with him. They had an unmarked police car nearby that was fully fueled, and they told him to just take that one. So he hauled Jill with him to the car, still holding a knife to her throat, and got inside the car, and then the car chase started all over again. He gave it a good go again, but this time he tried to swerve a police roadblock and failed, so he crashed into another wall. This time he wasn't given another vehicle immediately. Peter Hughes, who had been leading the investigation until then, was woken up in the middle of the night and been made aware of this car chase, and he immediately got up and got involved. So by the time Bill crashed the second car, Peter Hughes was in charge of negotiating. This time Billy had taken Jillian at axe point. He no longer had the knife with him for some reason, though he didn't tell police that. He told police he still had a knife, but this time he had the axe that he always kept with him, and he held her at axe point, which I'm not sure if it's more terrifying or if it makes a difference. I don't know if it's scarier to be held at axe point than knife point, but that is just pretty sick. He was hoping that he could use Jill as leverage for his demands. He wanted a car that was fully fueled, and he wanted to be able to run away. Basically, he wanted to just be able to escape and nobody chase him, but he knew that wasn't exactly realistic. Peter Hughes obviously wasn't exactly an expert in negotiations. He had never really been in a hostage situation of that intensity before, but he knew that if he could buy some time, he could calm Billy down and hopefully keep Jill relatively safe. Of course, Billy wasn't ready to let Jill go. He knew that he needed to keep her as leverage. Even if he got a car and his demands were met, he would still need to keep Jill until he was on the run again. So Peter was trying to reason with Billy and calm him down. He made sure to show that he wasn't armed, that he wasn't dangerous, and he just wanted to talk. And he even offered himself as a hostage instead of Jill. So he said, let's just swap. I'll be your hostage, leave Jill alone, let her go. She's been through enough, and you're better than this. Like, what have you come to? You're now using women as leverage. You're now attacking women. You're stronger than this. You're better than this. You can do better than using a woman as leverage. And actually, Billy did consider swapping with Peter Hughes because he was quite flattered that a chief inspector was woken up in the middle of the night to deal with the situation. Like, little old him managed to get the attention of a chief inspector, and Billy really liked that. Of course, what Billy didn't know is that the entire time there were officers in the shadows with shotguns, ready to shoot if things really got dicey. Of course, only when they could get a clear shot of Billy. After some back and forth, kind of going nowhere with Peter and Billy, Jill finally reached her breaking point. For real this time. She had had enough, and she finally realized that even if she did everything he said, she wouldn't be safe. She wanted to go back home. She didn't know what was going on with her family. She was becoming increasingly suspicious of Billy and his promises, especially since she knew that he had injured her mom, and she kind of broke down. And he snapped. He started yelling at her, blaming her for everything. Again, with Billy, as I said in the first part, it is never his fault. He has never taken accountability or responsibility for his actions, and he always blames everybody else in these situations. But because Jill was finally starting to resist and fight back, he started struggling with her, and he managed to actually hit her in the head with the axe. But Peter Hughes took advantage of this struggle to grab a hold of Billy and fight directly with him while hoping that Jill would be able to get herself out of the car. Now, it was a very awkward fight because it was nighttime, there wasn't a lot of light, and Billy and Jill were both inside the car, but Peter was outside the car trying to struggle with Billy. So it was a very awkward fight, and out of nowhere, an officer who had managed to get close enough to Billy shot Billy in the head. And the bullet did hit Billy in the head, but it kind of just bounced off, and it just seemed to make him even crazier. Like, he just lost it even more, if that was possible. Again, this man does not experience pain the way the average person does, and he is incredibly strong. He kept trying to fight off Peter and Jill with his axe when the officer shot him again in the left shoulder this time, but it still didn't stop Billy. He shot a third time but missed when another officer who had a clear shot through the windshield finally shot Billy dead. Jill was finally free, and she actually was brought to the hospital straight away just to deal with her injuries. And she did have an injury from the axe to her head, but it wasn't very severe. It had been stitched up, but she was fine. At least that wound was fine, but obviously they needed to deal with the emotional and mental trauma she had just been through. And of course, she still didn't know what had happened at Pottery Cottage, and they needed to make sure that she was stable enough before announcing the bad news. She was incredibly relieved to finally be away from Billy, though for quite a few days she was very heavily sedated. But once she was deemed stable enough, an officer sat down with her and told her everything. Her only answer to the Pottery Cottage murders and losing her entire family was, "There's no one left then, is there?" And the officer said, "No, love, there isn't." And it's such a devastating story for the entire family, not just for Jill. As Jill kept saying, she said, "Don't feel sorry for me, feel sorry for the ones I've lost," because she's incredibly brave and incredibly strong, and she somehow managed to pull through. But obviously it was incredibly hard for her to move past the fact that she had lost absolutely everyone. She ended up staying with some close friends for quite a while, and all of her friends came together to help her through this extremely traumatic event. The funeral service for Sarah, Richard, Amy, and Arthur was held on January 21st, 1977 in Chesterfield. Meanwhile, Jean Hughes, who was still married to Billy, she gave quite a few interviews, and she said that she no longer loves Billy and that she hates what he's done, but that he was extremely sick and that he never got the help that he needed. Which is possible. I mean, clearly this man is not your average person, and he doesn't react to situations like a normal person would, but I don't know if it's entirely fair to just blame the fact that he had a mental illness when there has been no confirmation of that by any professional. And you can't just dismiss everything he's done just because he didn't get the help he needed. At the end of the day, he mostly got himself into these situations. Of course, Jean was still living off of the government and benefits, and she couldn't afford to have Billy's body brought back to Blackpool. So it was decided that Billy would be buried in Boythorpe Cemetery, which is a cemetery near Chesterfield. And it actually started a series of protests because people from that area said, "He is not from here. We do not want him here. It's disrespectful to have him here. He is from Blackpool. He needs to go back to Blackpool or bury him with all the other murderers in the prison." There's like I guess there was a prison cemetery somewhere. So they didn't want anything to do with Billy. They didn't want him in the area, and they thought it would be incredibly disrespectful to the Mintons and the Morans and Jill that he would be buried in that area. And even taxi drivers got together to announce that they would not provide any services to Jean should she come to that area. They had all memorized her picture from the newspapers, and they knew what she looked like, and if she ever came around and needed a lift, she could just walk. They would not give her a lift anywhere to attend her husband's funeral. Unfortunately and tragically, because of all of the protests, there ended up being a switch in plans for Billy's funeral, and he ended up having his funeral in the same chapel and crematorium as Sarah, Arthur, Amy, and Richard, which is just incredibly messed up. So I don't know how that happened, but that just adds an entire level of trauma to this whole situation. Billy's daughter, Nicola, would get bullied at school all the time, and kids would come up to her and say, "Your dad's a murderer," and she didn't really actually know what happened to Billy or why Billy had died, but she would always defend him. She would even throw bricks through people's windows. Like the kids who would bully her, she would throw bricks through their windows, and they would just say, "See, you're a psychopath just like him," which is incredibly, like, this is just awful. I understand it's kids bullying other kids, so maybe the kids don't understand the impact of their words, but as a child, being told that you're a psychopath and that your dad's a murderer and that you're just going to turn out just like him must be incredibly damaging. It wasn't until she turned 14 that Jean finally confessed to Nicola what her father had done, and she showed her the newspapers, and of course Nicola was furious that Jean would keep this from her for so long. She also hated that her dad did something like that because she had a very different impression of her dad. She loved her dad growing up, and she only knew him when she was a child, so she had a very hard time reconciling the fact that this dad who she loved also went on to murder an entire family. And she would fight with her mom quite a lot, and Jean didn't help the situation because whenever Nicola would rebel or fight back or argue with Jean, she would just say, "See, you've got a temper, you're just like your dad," which again, incredibly stressful for a child to be compared to your murderer dad when, you know, there's no indication that Nicola has the same behavior or pattern as her dad. Jean started drinking heavily, and Nicola ended up addicted to antidepressants. And on May 13th, 1998, Jean overdosed on medication in her bathroom. Less than a year later, Nicola, who had children, tried to imitate her mom by overdosing in the bathroom, the same bathroom her mom had died in. But fortunately, she survived. She pulled through. She didn't take enough medication, and this was the push she needed to live her life to the fullest and to kind of snap out of it. And she decided to just leave the house she had grown up in, leave the house where she had known her dad, leave the house where her mom had died, and take care of her kids. And she just took off, moved somewhere else, and started fresh. And that's exactly what she needed. She moved away, she made new friends, and she finally stopped being compared to her dad. The people she met, the new friends she met didn't really know who she was in regards to her dad, and that seemed to kind of be a fresh start for her. So as far as I'm concerned, she is still doing okay. Jill, on the other hand, again, incredibly brave and strong, honestly, to a point where I'm also, like, I'm in shock that she managed to overcome this entire event and still choose happiness and still manage to live a fulfilling life. She just wanted to get back to living life, and she just wanted to get back and move on basically from the whole event. She would just pretty much force herself to stop reliving those moments and to stop thinking about her family, as bad as it sounds. She didn't want to keep thinking about them that way because it was stopping her from living life. She knew she couldn't bring them back. So she absolutely hates Billy, but she feels relieved that he's dead because she no longer has to look over her shoulder. And she's actually managed to not spiral into bitterness and resentment or depression, which is, again, I would absolutely 100% just be at the bottom of the barrel. Just like, I don't think I could get past this. So it's incredibly inspiring that she managed to pull through. But she says that overall people have been very kind. They have sent her lovely letters from all over the country, and it really shows how classy she is. Like, she's really, really trying to focus on how nice some people have been. Even though the press, the media, a lot of people have been absolutely horrendous about her, making up rumors, making up stories. She ended up going back to work fairly quickly, and she met someone else. They got married, and they had a baby together, actually. And she named that baby Jane Sarah, in memory of Sarah. And it was quite nice to hear that she actually had completely rebuilt her life. She managed to move forward. She ended up moving to the south of Ireland, mostly to get away from the press and just, honestly, again, start fresh, because she had so many people from her previous life where she lived, and the press were kind of hounding her. So she moved to Southern Ireland, and she became a jockey for a while. She was quite successful. I think that's kind of neat. And basically, a journalist did manage to track her down to Southern Ireland, and they kind of questioned her, and she said, look, she's put everything behind and her life is very happy, which is kind of like a very small silver lining in this horrible, horrible story. Of course, as a result of this case, there have been quite a lot of questions regarding the prisons, why the prisons weren't informed that Billy was extremely dangerous, why the paperwork wasn't filed, why the forms were missing, why he was allowed to work in a kitchen around knives, how a knife could go missing, and how he wasn't searched properly for the knife when it went missing, as well as why he was transported in a taxi, even though we have established in the first video that that was quite common, but he should have, because he was high risk, he shouldn't have been transported in a taxi. He should have been transported in like some sort of ironclad just truck, like just the highest security truck you could find. Medical professionals say that there was no way to know Billy Hughes would end his life in such a violent way. But family and friends of him growing up have all said that they all knew Billy would go out in a very violent way. They knew him well enough to know that he would never have a peaceful, normal life, that he was very violent, and he never showed any remorse for his actions. But then again, he also never took accountability for his actions, so it's hard to feel remorse when you straight up refuse responsibility or accountability for anything you've ever done. So of course, there was very little room for him to improve or get better or be back on track. But again, you can't possibly be an average person and go on to murder 3 generations of one family over 2 days. So that's it for today's video, guys. My brain is fried. This video is so long. I'm very sorry. If you've made it this far, thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed this story. In the first video, I said this was quite a popular case in the UK. I take it back. No one in the UK I've ever spoken to knows about this. So if you've never heard of the Pottery Cottage murders, please let me know down below. If you've watched this far, please comment down below. Let me know what you think of this story. But please like and subscribe. And the next video is going to be a little break from true crime, but I will be back in 2 weeks with some more true crime content. I need a little break after this case. I kind of had to hold myself at gunpoint to finish this. This was incredibly hard to research because it's just been such a horrible story to go through. But I'm happy I could share with you guys. I had never heard of this before, so maybe you haven't either. I'm done. I'm going to bed. I hope you like this video, and I will see you next time. Bye.